Well, thanks very much, and good afternoon, everyone. For those who were with me yesterday afternoon, I guess I apologise. I don't know if Danny's in here, but it was genuinely coincidental that he and I showed many of the same pictures. I'd like to point out to Danny, if you are in here, I ride an electric motorbike, not an electric car. It's far cooler. But I want to talk about the session we had yesterday for those that weren't in the room. We basically got up and had a look at, well, where does the future of the energy industry, where does it look like it's going ahead? And what's that mean for the different industries? I think it's fair to say, with total respect to Danny, that he's obviously very enthusiastic regarding the solar business. But what's that mean for those of us who are subject to pretty phenomenal change? What sorts of other views might have been out there was one of the big focuses. So, to introduce where I guess a whole bunch of other people in the energy world think the world is headed. Yesterday we talked about the Future Grid Forum, which was a very large process that was convened by the industry. It incorporated all of the ENA regarding our previous speaker and all these institutions. So pretty much everyone from large generators who you could argue have got a fair bit to protect, through to the most strident green PV solar groups, through to people in the middle such as consumer groups, industry, distribution companies and so on. These guys got together for an 18-month period, did some navel gazing and said, where do we think the world is headed? There was a whole bunch of economic modelling and analysis done to say, well, where's the world headed and what does that mean? And they basically came up with two most likely scenarios, to cut to the chase. The first of those scenarios, they called Rise of the Prosumer. This is kind of similar to what Danny was talking about this morning, where the basic idea is people's houses will trade energy amongst themselves. So we're similar to what we have today, but people might have batteries and solar cells on the roof, and consumers will take a much more active role in how they generate, consume energy. The second scenario was called Leaving the Grid. The difference with this scenario is that people actually cut the cord. They completely disconnect from the grid and supply energy to themselves. So there's very large uptake of battery technologies, electric cars and so on, where people simply do not need the local electricity grid. Let me just recap on that again. These two scenarios were agreed upon by an entire spectrum of industry, from the most conservative, it's never going to happen sorts of people, to the most zealous, everything, we should go 100% renewables. And they've both said by 2030 to 2050, these two scenarios are where we think the world is going. What's some key results from those scenarios? 30 to 40% of Australia's generation will be on-site, not centralised, generators located in the basement of a supermarket or in our house, on the roof, outside in some batteries, etc. Disconnecting from the grid completely will be financially viable by 2030 at the latest. In other words, it will be cheaper for you to disconnect from the grid and supply yourself by 2030. I think this one's kind of amazing. It's financially preferable, as in it will be cheaper for you, for all customers to have on-site generation by 2050. So by 2050, you're better off if you have a generator on the roof or in the basement of your house or building. These were agreed upon, the logos, the rubber stamped on the front page of this report by all of those industry players. So yesterday we spent a fair bit of time going through these scenarios and saying, well, what do we think? What does the industry in this room think, and what does that mean for training? When these scenarios are talked about in the media today, lots of people, including myself yesterday, like to use the phrase the death spiral. They like to use an example that incumbent utilities are going downhill. Their business is disappearing. As they jack up the price to deal with that, more people put solar on. As more people put solar on, there's less people buying energy, etc., etc., etc. We spiral downwards. The key phrase they use is death spiral. For the people who were in the room with me yesterday, I've changed the picture pretty significantly from that spiral that we had yesterday. Because sure, I think we're in for some pretty significant change, but one of the amazing takeaways I got out of the room yesterday, when industry went away and came back and gave me their feedback, was, yes, there's change happening, but the spiral doesn't end in death. There's a light at the end of that tunnel, and there's some pretty amazing opportunities for all of us out there. So what does that mean for industry skills councils and you guys as trainers? When I went home and Ross and I caught up after the dinner last night, I can see you over there, Ross, and we thought we'd go over our notes of what everyone said. I got them out this morning, and it said, the Vas Felix Cab Malo was much lighter than the Rosalie Shiraz. And then it went downhill from there. I said, well, the Penfolds just isn't bloody worth it. So they weren't quite the notes that I was hoping. I went and dug up some of my older notes this morning after I'd slept off that little episode, and turned out the industry covered a really wide range of material. Concerns were raised such as the ageing workforce and will there be enough people to deal and cope with all of this phenomenal change that's going on? What about the life of the assets? All the modelling that we talked about yesterday showed that we're still going to have conventional coal and gas generation for many years, yet if you talk to the people in industry, these assets have only got a life out to the 2020s. What happens after that? There was talk about, well, what does it mean for us? What does it mean? Is this a death spiral? And the impressive thing, even from the electricity supply industry, the transmission and distribution guys, who arguably have the most change confronting them, they actually were positive about this. They said, well, this is pretty impressive for us. The gas guys were happy because we showed a lot of increase in gas generation and so on. And I think one of the short stories out of the electricians was, well, you're still going to need electricians, so bring it on. What's all this mean for training? To think about what it means for training, I wanted to tell a couple of stories, if you'll bear with me, late in the day. The first of these stories is about the complexity that this stuff means to consumers, to businesses and to mums and dads. So I want to give you a bit of a test. I don't have the fancy tools of this morning, but I want you to look at this graph and just answer to yourself that question. So this is a graph showing the number of births in America over history, how many people were born. There's no tricks. During which period was there a decline in the number of births in America? We're all happy with that? So of course there's two periods, 57 to 67 and 67 to 77. Why am I showing you this graph? This graph is used in a standardised test given to the entire Australian population and indeed to populations all over the world to try and estimate people's numerical literacy. There's a whole bunch of questions just like this in the test. And the results show that 54% of the Australian population cannot get that graph right, cannot get the answers right to that question. 54% of our population, over half, are numerically illiterate. That's a pretty scary statistic to me. It's a fundamentally scary statistic when we're talking about doing things like rolling out time of use tariffs to people when they'll have to figure out when is the cheapest period for them to consume their electricity. If people can't look at that graph and say that it was declining for those two periods, what hope have we got for them to look at a convoluted electricity tariff and say this is the period that it's cheapest for me to consume, or this is the right tariff for me? It turns out Australians aren't particularly dumb or stupid. That 50% number is common to most developed countries around the world. It opens up a massive opportunity for people such as ourselves, because the world is getting more complex. We had a question early this morning about, well, what happens when the world gets more complex and how will people manage things? Danny's answer was automation, and I think that's certainly part of the way there, but we're going to need to educate people. Everyone from consumers, Mrs. Smith at home, who can't answer that question, all the way through to our practitioners who will have to tell you, well, do you turn off the air conditioner? Do you discharge the battery? Turn on the solar system, which was disabled from exporting? What of these multiple levers you now can pull, which one should you pull to deal with your current situation? That level of complexity is a dramatic increase, and we're not equipped to deal with it. I wanted to talk about another story. This photo is a photo of a switchboard from the New Yorker Hotel. For those with a keen eye, it's a DC switchboard. For people like myself, I'm a bit of an electrical engineering nerd. In the 1800s, we had a bit of a battle between Westinghouse, who was all about AC electrical power, and Edison, who was all about DC electrical power. They got into all sorts of messy stuff where Edison was electrocuting cats and showing what horrific things AC did, so we should use DC, etc. We know who won that battle. We use AC to transmit electricity around the world. In places like New York City and San Francisco, Edison got there first, and they were using DC to distribute electricity around many buildings for a long time. The last DC electricity distribution was removed out of New York City in 2007. That switchboard was pulled out of the New Yorker Hotel last year. So from the mid-1800s to 2007, there was still DC distribution going on, but it was a pretty slow rate of change. Not much happened. When I went to university, I didn't want to enter the power utility industry because it was boring. The same things were going on for over and over and over. So just to reflect again, that's a photo, 2007, we pulled out all the last remaining DC out of New York. Next weekend, there's a conference in the US about the DC power distribution business. The first international conference on DC power distribution. We're revisiting the future. Because of all of the DC loads, DC generators and so on, there is a growing demand and suggestion that we should be using DC to distribute energy at street level. Now, it's a long way away, but here's the first international conference happening next weekend. So we've gone from a period of horrifically slow change, where we went from AC to finally rip out the DC. We're talking about putting DC back in. So even for practitioners such as ourselves, who are hopefully pretty familiar with this stuff, the pace of change in our industry is dramatic. We're talking about huge shifts from AC to DC distribution again. So what does all that mean for people such as ourselves, and particularly for industry skills councils? We have massive growing complexity that businesses, consumers, all the way through to practitioners are facing. Dramatic change, for example, returning back to DC reticulation. There is a fundamental need for a bridge between that change and the education institutions. To be able to, for the education institutions to simply be able to keep up and know where industry's at and what we should be teaching. That was some of the key feedback we got out of yesterday's session. So I wanted to get to a few more homework items or key feedback things that I took away from yesterday, specifically related to training and to industry skills councils. There was a very big point made about cross-disciplinary skills. Now we're talking about people that might install a cogen air conditioning system that generates electricity, that is a refrigeration system, and it's burning gas. There's three fundamentally different skills covered by multiple skills councils that we probably need to interact with better. There was a lot of discussion about knowledge workers. In addition to people simply installing these sorts of things, who is going to be out there giving the advice to consumers and businesses who are faced with these complex tariffs about what measures they can take and when? So not just about practical installation skills, but about the knowledge and the advisory capability to help people. There was a discussion and an item for homework, I guess, to consider later about how much should we specialise. On one point of view, industry came back and said, well, do we really need practitioners who know everything, who can cover the entire operation? Possibly we just need someone who's a real expert at a very narrow field, and that's all we need. They don't need to be covering the width of the field. On the other hand, there was an opposing view that said, well, yes, we do need them to know everything, but actually can they? Is it possible to fit everything into one individual's head, given the breadth of change that's occurring in this industry? I think those sorts of items are something the feedback I took was very important for the ISCs to look at. There was some commentary that we need to develop new units of competency for these new technologies, everything from batteries to new types of inverter operation to grid interactive vehicles and so on. And equally, there was a need to drive the uptake of these new units. Some examples were given yesterday afternoon that there are new units that already exist that were developed 4 years ago that are only just now starting to creep into educational programs. So how can we encourage the uptake of these new units was one of the clear feedbacks we got yesterday afternoon. So to summarise, I think we've heard yesterday and again this morning that there is massive change ahead, massive opportunity ahead, and from my perspective, all of this change and opportunity was agreed upon by industry. They were saying, yeah, bring it on. There is change, but we see it as a real positive thing. We're going to need you guys, the trainers and industry skills councils, to help us to get that change implemented into our educational programs. So for me, who's at the forefront of all of this stuff? Who's going to drive it and make it a positive thing rather than a horrific mess? It's you guys.
Very interesting presentation, Glenn. Ian Neeson's my name. Look, I always have a problem with that specialist. We train specialists up. So we had sometime years ago, we had a thing called we brought in restricted electrical licences because if a mechanical fitter wanted to do a bit of maintenance on a pump, you needed to have an electrician with him to disconnect it, and we combined those two skills. So I think there's a lot of thought, and this might be a question rather than a comment rather than a question, but a response from you would be interesting. That if you get too specialised, it might have a lot of people, but you need too many people to do one job. Whereas if you have somewhat of generalisation, and I think the challenge for those developing competencies is going to be to be able to put together that a generalisation that people can cope with without being too broad.
Yeah, look, it's in part I'm going to dodge the question because the feedback was, there were clearly opposing views in the room yesterday afternoon as to whether we should have specialisation or not. And I think that's homework, is to use my word, for the people setting these competency programs. But what's my personal view? Thinking off the cuff, I mean, it's a vexed question because on one hand, I go out there and talk with my students about new technologies, and they all get really nervous about, for example, photovoltaic solar systems. And then I show them a circuit diagram that has a DC source and some resistive loads, and they solve that, and then I say, well, that DC source is just a solar panel. And they go, well, hang on, that was really easy. Just because it's got the word solar photovoltaic, people get all nervous and think that we need a speciality to deal with it. Now, on some level, that's true when you go to install it, but when you go to the level of engineering the system or designing the system, the key skills are already there. So I don't have an answer. I think in some sense, the generality may need to shift, and instead of being general electrical, it might be general distributed generation, which includes, gas, PV, batteries and other skills that aren't typically considered electro-technology. I don't know, but yeah, it's a good point, and it's something we need to have the debate about.
If you think about the change that's coming, I've come from aviation many years ago. Now, as a licensed aircraft maintenance engineer, you learn about air conditioning, you learn about avionics, you learn about airframe, flight systems, hydraulics, pneumatics, etc. So, in some ways, that's what you're confronted with. To to the point that people might have to learn a number of different skills to be able to cope, with, the problem or what's in front of them. And I think you've got to think more broadly about how we tackle the issue. But I think there needs to be some sort of working group starting now to start to look at how they're going to tackle the problem. Because from looking at Danny's presentation this morning, it's going to happen very quickly.
Oh, I absolutely agree with the urgency. At the opposite end, as a user of this technology and someone who, in my day job, I'm regularly looking for people to design and install it, it's a shortage of confident people as opposed to competent people, and finding those people that can have that mix of skills. The demand's there today, it really is. Despite all the political uncertainty, it's there now, because if you get known as the good guy who can do this, they're travelling all over Australia doing it. So I totally agree with you.
Glenn, just on that whole issue and what we call a convergence of technologies, that's is going to be the real dilemma for the development of training packages in the future. The point I'm trying to make is, at the end of the day, somebody's got to make a decision of what that person that you talk about looks like. So for me, it'll be a scenario of saying, what's this futuristic looking, say it's an electrician or a gas person, and actually building what they look like and then developing the units based on it. And I would like to ask you if I could come to you and sit down and talk about how you see that person would look like in 5 years' time, or maybe 3 years' time. At the end of the day, you reverse engineer.
Yeah, sure.
And that's the type of thing that we're looking at now, and when we do those scenario type things.
Absolutely. I personally would love to be involved, but if I might, with absolute respect, almost push back a bit and say, I think that's the perfect role for people like EOS is to, because if we go out to industry, they will give you 50 million different versions of that person. But pretty quickly, with the sort of central position of an organisation like EOS, we should be able to distill that down to 10 prototypical versions that can do most things for most industries. And I'd love to be involved in that process, but I see that as one of the, I use the word bridge, and you guys are the bridge between someone calling for 50,000 different individuals, because that's what they'll do, to saying, here's the 10 prototypical ones that'll pretty much do everyone. And
Glenn, Anthony Plevery from EOS. Just one thing mostly to finish off this discussion about the person of the future. One of the other things that's being discussed is, will the new operative be a smarter person? And should we, as an industry, be looking for, along with this idea of whether they're a generalist or a specialist, should there be then higher level skills? And that goes to the idea of knowledge workers and that sort of thing. Do you think that generally the level of skill should rise across the industry as well?
Well, that's a hard question, because I'm often, because I'm some sort of weird nerd, I've got a few too many letters after my name, and most of them are unnecessary, so is my view. So the people that I've learnt the most from, even though I've gone and done lots of higher degrees, are the guys who are on the ground doing the work, who have the practical skills. When Danny talked about insane levels of uptake this morning of solar photovoltaic systems, they don't need someone with a PhD who designs at what point the thyristors should be firing. We only need a couple of those. We need people who can do a basic level of design and then be installing the systems in a safe, compliant, and and critically thought manner that says, well, that tree over there west of me is probably going to grow up and shade this thing, so I shouldn't put the panel there. But none of that level of practical knowledge is entirely capable of all of our students. The knowledge worker thing, again, to me, that's not someone with a bachelor, master's, PhD. It's someone that can go around and look at your house and get past the crap that's on Current Affair, that your video standby is not where your energy consumption's going, and tell you that most of your household energy consumption goes to things that get hot and cold. Your fridge, your hot water system, your air conditioner, and help you figure out how to reduce the energy of those. So when I say knowledge worker, it's a step above what the general population who struggle with that graph is. But if you can answer that graph and you've got some common sense, I think that's the sort of knowledge worker I'm talking about. Yes, there'll always be a need for more highly trained people, but I don't see this stuff as needing a shift up in that level of intelligence, to use your word, or I think that it's just a change in thought in what we do.